Good morning, everyone. Francisco will be working with Dr. Kennedy for the question and answer sessions, so I'll turn it over to them.
Good afternoon, Green Lake Church. We are so happy to have you today on the fourth, and I think it's the last session for this spring lecture series with the Dr. Titus Kennedy, who has been a part. I really appreciate that he did that for us. And I think and I believe you all have enjoying this time together. I know there's a lot of information that we already review, and it's just gonna be like a little snaps and on any of those topics. But I know some of you are really interested to participate in a Q&A session. That's why we scheduled that at this time. And I appreciate that you stay with us. I would like to limit this session just to like 45 minutes, which is gonna be just starting like 2 minutes ago. And the questions are gonna be attended as they come. So first come, serve. Send the questions via chat or raise your hand and we can spot your imagine or your microphone so you can talk directly with Dr. Kennedy. Just before to do your questions, if you want to do verbally, just remember unmute your microphones in order to listen to you very well. So I think we are ready to go on, Dr. Kennedy. Are you ready?
Yeah, I am. And I can start with some questions that we had pasted into the chat. So we have some questions from Dennis. The first one, he asks about the Jubilee cycles and sabbatical cycles, which can be calculated backwards. And he asked about the attempts made to calculate the Exodus date from the number of cycles working backwards. And I would say that if people are interested in that this is addressed at least somewhat in an article by Bryant Wood on the dating of the Exodus, and he combines that with some of the other chronological discussion, such as the years that we see in the Bible about the chronology. And at least in his opinion, it coincides with the chronology that we get from the biblical numbers that I discussed last night about the Exodus. The second one is there have been debates in archaeological circles related to Kadesh Barnea. Is there now consensus about the Kadesh Barnea of the wanderings? I would say that there's general consensus about Kadesh Barnea, Ein Kadesh. There's a spring in the Sinai wilderness. It's actually the largest spring or oasis in the whole Sinai wilderness, and there's an archaeological site there, and then there's another one nearby that's slightly later from more the Israelite kingdom period, but at this oasis there are remains from actually even before the Exodus wandering period and then during the Exodus wandering period, essentially showing that it was used as an oasis by people who were wandering or who were nomads in the Sinai wilderness area. So the general consensus would be yes, in that area at that site. And there is a little bit of evidence, as I said, of people being there during the late Bronze Age, or what we would say would be the wandering period. But of course, this is not a normal type of site where you have a whole city that's built or no inscriptions or anything like that. The third question we see in the chat asks about some archaeological work at a site north of Jericho called Khirbet el Mastara. And he asks about the findings from this site and which are claimed by some to be a site that was a staging point for the wandering Hebrews before they started moving across the Jordan River into the hill country after pacification. Okay, so let's correct some geography. First of all, this site is on the western side of the Jordan River, so it's after the Israelites would have come over the Jordan. But this was a site surveyed by an archaeologist named Adam Zertal, and he was looking for Gilgal basically, and he proposed some different ideas. This site in particular, it is quite close to Jericho. So if we're talking about in terms of, are we looking for a Gilgal site, a staging site, something like that? It's about 5 miles north of Jericho. So it is pretty close. But the findings there don't really allow us to connect it to Gilgal or necessarily even an Israelite kind of campsite or staging site, because they did find possibly some late Bronze Age material there, but they also found earlier material from the Middle Bronze Age. So it seems like it was just a place used by nomads for a long time. And these circular structures they find there, they're probably sheep pens, goat pens. So it would be hard for us to really say if that could be connected with the Israelites during the wandering or the conquest period before they settled down. There are a number of places proposed for Gilgal. None of them really have any evidence where we could say with high probability that could be the site. There is name preservation for Gilgal. There's a site near Jericho that has the site name Tel Jaljul, okay, in Arabic. So basically the mound of Gilgal. And so there is a memory of that, but how early that name goes back and so forth, we're not really sure of. Gilgal, the original Gilgal at least, was just a campsite for the Israelites when they were still working as getting into the land as nomads and staging, as you had mentioned in your question. Okay. We have another question in the chat from Carla. She asks about the languages used by the ancient Hebrews, given that they did not leave stone artifacts to record their presence in either Egypt or Canaan during the time of Joshua, and that God forbade them from creating stone artifact depictions. Is there any way to actually verify their presence in those places at those times using artifacts or evidence from their own culture? Is language a possible path as it evolves over time and is influenced by adjacent and concurrent cultures? So we do have some early Hebrew inscriptions, but probably the earliest that we have that we could say definitively comes from around 1100 BC. It's called the Isbet Sarta Ostracon, and this comes from the site of Ebenezer, the ancient city of Ebenezer. So that's during the Judges period, and that's kind of where we start seeing some Hebrew inscriptions popping up. Now, prior to that, we have other people mentioning the Israelites or recording people with Hebrew names. So I would say that is our kind of linguistic evidence. There also in the Sinai, there are some ancient Semitic inscriptions that date to the time before the Exodus. So I guess we could say the enslavement period, the sojourn in Egypt. Now, these aren't necessarily Hebrew inscriptions, but they record Semitic languages used by the slaves at that time, of which the Hebrews would have been part of that. But they're very short and they're very kind of difficult to decode, so they're not as clear as some of the other information that I talked about, for example, in the Exodus and Joshua presentations. So hopefully that answers your question. a bit. We have another one from Dana asking about experimental archaeology. What is it and your experience with it, and perhaps what experiments you would like to do or see done? So experimental archaeology, in a way, this is kind of like how scientists in the hard scientists do laboratory experiments. They're trying to reproduce things, right? So that's what experimental archaeology is about. It's about trying to reproduce ancient artifacts and the techniques that they use. So one example could be we see artwork of Assyrian archers, and they've got these bows, right? And we have some information and written sources about their bows. And so we try to make an Assyrian bow with the same materials and the same techniques that they do, and then test it out, see how well it shoots the arrows. Or slings, for example. I told you in the Joshua lecture, we found a lot of sling stones in our excavation at Tel. And so we can use those sling stones, or we can make new sling stones with the same stone from the same place, the same size and everything. And then we can make a sling according to the ancient techniques. And then we can test that out and try to fire those slings and see how well they work, or how difficult it is to learn that and master that. So those are a couple examples, but pottery is another thing, trying to reproduce how pottery was made, or how pottery was decorated, or inscriptions, or even building buildings. So there was one really cool experiment, if you will, where a group of archaeologists, they actually tried to build a house from the time of the Canaanites and Israelites using those same techniques. And then they burned it down also to see that. Or bread making, people make bread ovens. So some of the stuff I've been involved in, reproducing inscriptions, trying out sling stones and slinging, some stuff that's not related to biblical archaeology, but an addle is a type of weapon that was used by some ancient hunter-gatherers. And bread making. And so those are the kinds of things that you see in experimental archaeology. Making flint tools, actually, and trying those out. We've done that too. You break off pieces of obsidian into a blade, and then you try to cut meat with it. It actually works very well. So we're just trying to figure out how they made this stuff, how well it worked, if our ideas about it and the written sources really make sense, and if we can reproduce that so we have a better understanding of it. Yes, producing mud bricks is also a way that you can do with experimental archaeology, and making like those mud bricks that the ancient Israelites or the Egyptians made, and then trying to build with them. And they work well. I mean, people use those still today to build houses in some places. All right, so that looks like
I would like to invite somebody wants to do a verbally question. You are welcome to. We have another question on the chat from Dennis.
We got one more chat question there. How much of the non-Hebrew Egyptian language words appear in the writings of Moses? And is the name Moses itself an Egyptian related royal name related to Tutmos and others? From Dennis. So there are many Egyptian words, not just names, found in the Torah and the writings of Moses. And what we could say from that, easily, obviously say, is that the author, the writer, he knew Egyptian. He was very familiar with the Egyptian, and he used many Egyptian words. Didn't just borrow them, they were in his vocabulary. So that's actually something that you could throw into the argument for the authorship of the books of Moses by somebody who had been raised in Egypt like Moses, and for that early authorship. As far as the name Moses, it does, yes, seem to be related to this Egyptian word meses, which means born of, and is used in a variety of New Kingdom, 18th dynasty, and some other periods too, but from Egypt, like Thutmose. So yes, that I would say also seems to connect to the Egyptian ideas. Of course, that according to Exodus, that name was given to him while he was in Egypt, and it would make sense that they might use something that was not only had a meaning in Egypt, but it seemed like it had a meaning for the Hebrews in ancient times also. Next chat question. You showed ash layers and burned grain in Jericho. Can you talk more about the radiocarbon dates that are produced from this material? Sure. So radiocarbon dates have usefulness, but limited usefulness. It really depends on where you're getting those samples from, if they've been contaminated, and what time period that they're from, because we don't have a complete picture or a completely calibrated radiocarbon curve. So whenever you do radiocarbon testing, they also have to calibrate it based on historical dates and other information about the change in radiation levels. So Jericho, for example, that destruction is in the Bronze Age. Well, there are known problems with Bronze Age radiocarbon dates from the Levant or from Canaan. And unfortunately, those ones at Jericho, they have quite a wide range. So from the destruction layer, you have radiocarbon dates ranging from the 1800s BC to the 1200s BC. So it really doesn't help us narrow it down much. The archaeological material, like the pottery and the scarabs, is much more precise at a site like that. But when you get later in time, like to the Israelite kingdom period, the radiocarbon dates are much more precise and reliable. Same with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those are really helpful for dating the Dead Sea Scrolls. Next question from Dana in the chat about the different interpretations of the numbers of the Israelites in the wandering. She says, even a population of 80,000 persons crossing the Reed Sea seems very large. I imagine it like 80,000 people plus sheep crossing the I-90 floating bridge, and it boggles my mind. Yeah, certainly. It is still a pretty big group logistically. And as you said, with the sheep, with all their animals. And of course, you've got people of different ages. So you have some elderly people who can't travel as fast. You got some kids who probably they're carrying with them, plus all their animals and what possessions they took out of Egypt. So yeah, it's a big group of people. It's not like an army marching. So it would have been difficult to manage that group, and crossing through the Reed Sea there. It would take some time, and that's what we see if we read through the biblical narrative. It takes them all night to get through that. So it's not just a quick 30-minute crossing there. Francisco, you want to take any live questions from people? They want to raise.
I would love to, but I cannot see on my gallery anybody who is raising a hand. Or we have another question on the chat from Carla Waters.
Okay. It says from Ken W. I loved all three of your lectures. Thank you. Question: an archaeology professor at Tel Aviv University says unequivocally that the Exodus story is myth, not history. He has no problem with that. What is your view of his view? So I addressed this in the Exodus lecture, somewhat at least, on Friday night. I didn't spend 3 hours looking at it, but we did spend about an hour. Most academics, most modern academics today take a skeptical view of biblical history, especially the Old Testament and the earlier parts of the Old Testament, including the Exodus, and they think that's myth, and their stance is based on their presumption that there isn't any archaeological evidence of the Israelites in Egypt or events of the Exodus and so on. But as I showed in that lecture, that we do in fact have quite a bit of evidence for the whole Exodus narrative and for Hebrews in Egypt and for certain events of the Exodus. So I would just say that they get that view because that's what they're taught and that's what their bias is, and they don't actually look into it. As the quote from William Deaver says that I shared last night, they consider the Exodus to be a dead issue. Okay, so they don't even think about it anymore. It's just assumed. Another question in chat from Dana. How do you estimate a population, as you did in the population drop in Canaan? And when the population began to rebound, what is the evidence that it was a different group? Pottery, building style, bone remains, something else? Great question. So estimating a population, it depends on what kind of population we're talking about. If we're talking about a population living in a city or a town, then you do that starting with things like the size of the city. And then you look at the density of the houses inside those city bounds. And then you look at how many people would have lived in a house. And some of that information you have to get from documents of the ancient time period on how big their families were, how big their households were. And you put that into a number of equations to get a more precise estimate based on the ancient data. So that was something I addressed in my dissertation, and you know, it would take a while to explain the whole thing, but hopefully you get it. Basically, family and household size of actual house, number of houses in a city or in a residential district, and the size of the city, and then you can start estimating that. As for nomadic populations, you're looking more at things like how many people could the land support, and what are the size of nomadic groups in similar geographic and climatic areas where we have actual records or censuses of that. And so then we can get a closer estimate. As for a different group, well, one thing that's suggestive of that is that new settlements popped up. But yes, as you said, as you mentioned in your question, pottery, building style, bone remains, those are definitely things that we see in terms of an Israelite identity that's different from the Canaanites. So they did have some cultural, material culture that carried over from Canaanite influence, but other things were distinctly Israelite. For example, no pig bones are found at Israelite sites because of the ban on eating pigs in the Mosaic Law. That's a major part. The pottery, it starts to develop its own distinct style. The Israelites developed their own distinct style eventually, and they also developed a different type of house that was arranged differently. Some archaeologists think that it actually had to do with the way that the Mosaic Law discussed purity and impurity. So yes, we can tell the difference between say some earlier Canaanite pottery and some later Israelite pottery. We can tell the difference between a Canaanite house and an Israelite house. And of course the bone remains, and the lack of idols also is a major thing. So there really aren't many idols found at Israelite sites until actually you get into about the 8th century. And then there's some things that start changing, and we actually see that in the Bible. And there's a lot of talk, you know, about religious syncretism and idol worship and stuff that the Israelites are chastised for. But earlier on, there's a lack of, you know, pagan temples and idols in the early Israelite sites. Okay, another question from Dennis. There have been recent findings at Gath, and specifically related to Goliath. Can you give us a quick update? Sure. So yes, Gath has been identified and partially excavated, and it's where we would expect it to be. And the findings there demonstrate that it was a Philistine city. And several years ago, they found this ostracon. So that's a piece of pottery with writing on it. It's pretty small, the one that we're talking about, but it has 2 names on there. And often it's described as two names that are linguistically related to Goliath. One of them, I think, is the name Goliath, so sometimes it's called the Goliath Ostracon. It's just not written in the same Hebrew spelling, but it represents Goliath. It dates to 10th or 9th century BC. So what that tells us is that the name Goliath was in use in Gath around the time of David, and it's not necessarily attestation of the Goliath that we find in the Bible, but it at least shows that that is historically accurate as far as reflecting the time period, the Philistines, the location.
Thank you, Gumi. You give us a shot. Before Danny's question, I think they came at the same time. There's another question above from my friend Jana Kapush. Is just right before the Dana's question. Is there any evidence of the Egyptian chariots that could have been lost in the Red Sea?
At present, no, there is not any evidence of Egyptian chariots lost in the Red Sea or the Reed Sea as it appears in Hebrew. I know there have been various claims about that on the internet by some people that are not archaeologists and selling videos and books and things like that. And, there's a few pictures that pop up also. But if you scrutinize those, you can see that they are not chariot wheels, Egyptian chariot wheels, and not of that time period. It's also from completely the wrong location where the sea crossing would have been. I think it's possible to find some remains like that if we were to locate the correct sea crossing, but it's a really big area, and getting a permit to even do that investigation is kind of impossible right now. But anyhow, short answer is no, not yet. Another question from Dennis says, the altar of Joshua as noted to be near Mount Ebal been identified? Some think yes. So there's an ancient altar on Mount Ebal that was excavated by Adam Zertal, and there's been a lot of discussion about that as to the date of it and to the exact identification of it. In my opinion, I think it's possible that the earliest structure there was a big altar from the time of Joshua, but it's difficult to say for certain. Dana, a question. Experimental archaeology. What would I Google to find reports or results? You might just look up experimental archaeology, even on YouTube, and there are probably a lot of videos that are doing different types of it that you can look at, from tools and cooking to building and weapons. From Carla, any comments on the extensive research on the Ugaritic culture and its interactions with the Hebrews? As far as we know, there wasn't really much interaction at all between Ugarit and the Hebrews. However, what Ugarit does, or rather what the excavations there, and especially translations of their archives, what those do for us with biblical studies and biblical archaeology is it helps us to understand the general culture and beliefs of sort of the Canaanite world, if you will, because the religious beliefs and practices in Ugarit were at least very similar to those of the Canaanites that the Israelites interacted with. So technically, Ugarit was located just outside of what we would call the area of Canaan, but they had, they used almost the same language and the same general belief systems. So it just gives us insight into the culture of Canaan.
Do we have any other questions? We have a new question.
Yes, we got one from Gumi. Do you have a favorite place that you have visited in your explorations and why? Yeah, I would say that one of my favorite places was actually Cyprus. We just saw a couple of slides from Cyprus in the Acts presentation, but it's this island in the Mediterranean. It's kind of a Hawaii of the Mediterranean, except it's got all sorts of ancient ruins on it and very well preserved. Some pretty incredible ancient Greek and Roman cities there, and later time periods also. So I really enjoyed visiting there. Then from Olia, there are opinions that many letters attributed to the Apostle Paul were not actually written by him. What is your opinion? My opinion is that he wrote the letters that we have attributed to him in the New Testament, in addition to some others that are mentioned, like the letter to Laodicea, which we no longer have, and the third letter to the Corinthians. That's really a position that didn't come up until modern times, when people are just extremely skeptical and trying to deconstruct the Bible. There's no evidence or no tradition of that. Dennis asks, how would you characterize the impact upon the Hebrews in their sojourn in Egypt and their subsequent slavery by the Hixos? Okay, but characterize the impact upon the Hebrews in their sojourn in Egypt. Well, they adopted some Egyptian things. For example, the early form of the Hebrew alphabet was adopted ultimately from Egyptian hieroglyphs, and we can see this in what's called Proto-Sinaitic. So the earliest alphabet ever found in history pops up in the Sinai Peninsula during what would also be the time of the Egyptian enslavement or sojourn, when the Hebrews were living in Egypt. And it was used by Semitic language speaking people to write down their language, but they took certain hieroglyphs from the Egyptian hieroglyphic system and they made them into an alphabet. And so that would have been what Moses used to write down the Pentateuch in this early alphabetic form. So that was one thing that they got from Egypt, and they got some words imported into the language too. Also, there were some material culture things that they brought with them, such as, okay, so you have Hebrews who are working in various jobs, right? Some of them are artisans, so they're making buildings, they're making objects, etc. We can see some of that influence of what they've learned in the building of the tabernacle and even the Ark of the Covenant. So there's some Egyptian stylistic things that are found in there, or we could at least say building techniques. So they adopted some stuff like that they learned. Hopefully that answers the question. You spoke of forced labor, from Dana. You spoke of forced labor, in parentheses, corvée, question mark, in Egypt. Was this the same as slavery? No. So corvée labor was something that was used by the Egyptians earlier on. That's what they actually used to build the Great Pyramids. And how this is different is that in the corvée labor system, or how the Great Pyramids were built, is that you would farm during one season in ancient Egypt, and then in the off season you're waiting for things to grow, and you don't really have to be out in the fields all the time. So the Pharaoh, he paid the people to build the pyramids during that time, and he did it basically just by giving them food and drink. So they weren't really paid like a wage, but they essentially had to do it. The peasants had to do it, but they were at least paid for it in a way, and they weren't enslaved. So that's different than what the Israelites experienced. Dennis asked, despite a lack of evidence, do you have an opinion on which Sinai mountain was the mountain of the laws, which was Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb. Yeah, I have an opinion. So about a year and a half ago, I spent a good amount of time in Sinai. The background behind me is actually from Sinai. Wandering around, hiking, going to different places. I spent, we stayed right next to what traditional Mount Sinai is, or Jebel Musa, it's called. And prior to that, I leaned towards Mount Sinai being located in the northeastern Sinai Peninsula, kind of closer to Kadesh Barnea. And much of that had to do with, we read in the beginning of Deuteronomy that it says it was an 11-day journey from Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea. And so I was thinking, all right, how long does it take this big group of people and all their possessions and animals to get there? And so it sort of restricts it to this radius around Kadesh Barnea. But then I got down to Mount Sinai, or Mount Moses, it's called Jebel Musa area, and I was exploring around there and spending a lot of time and climbing around and looking at everything, and it just fits so well with the descriptions in the Bible of the campsite and the mountain. And of course Josephus says that Mount Sinai was the tallest in the area, and Mount Catherine, which is part of traditional Mount Sinai, is actually the highest peak in the whole region. And also near there is this turquoise mining place, and the turquoise place also is mentioned in the wandering narratives, and it's pretty close. So I was a lot more convinced of traditional Mount Sinai, Jebel Musa area being the real Mount Sinai, although I still had this difficulty with how's that only an 11-day journey to Kadesh Barnea. But then I thought, well, maybe he's writing this in the context of that's how long it would take like Moses to get there when he was going places. And so one person or a small group could definitely do that in 11 days, but the whole group of the thousands and thousands of Israelites, that would have been too far. So that's what I would lean towards right now. All right, I think we have time for one more question, if there is one. We have a question from Carla. Do you have an overview interpretation of Philo of Alexandria? Could you be a little more specific with what you're asking there, maybe? He wrote a lot, so I'm not sure exactly what you're wanting to know. Is he historical? Yes, he's historical. I mean, I'm not sure if you mean, was he an historical person? Yeah, the guy named Philo, who lived in Alexandria, and he wrote historical material. I mean, he wrote a lot of philosophy and religion related things, but he wrote historical material too, or material that we can use to better understand history. So yes, now bear in mind that sometimes there are works from the ancient world that have a historical name attributed to them, but they were pseudo historical works. But as far as the actual writings of Philo of Alexandria, yes, those are useful for history.
It should be the same case with Flavio Josefo, right? Who wrote some chronics, histories from the Jesus, right, time?
Yes, they both did write about that time period. Mm-hmm.
I have a note from Dennis too. Thank you, Dr. Kennedy, for coming to visit us. It has been a fantastic. Well, we have just barely 4 minutes left, and it has been pretty dynamic session of Q&A. We have a lot of thumbs ups in our gallery too. And I would like just to express the big gratitude we feel, Dr. Kennedy, because you are part this beautiful time for being with us at our community. Hopefully it would be in person in our facility, which is gonna be open soon, as soon as in the next month. And we hopefully extend the invitation to be with us one day in our beautiful temple. And of course, Dr. Kennedy has his own social media sites, as an Instagram has been display on the screen, and he has his own way to reach him on the institute. And of course, the book is in Amazon, and it's not expensive. It's really accessible. It's just like $18. It's not like advertisement, but I like to say that. And Dr. Kennedy is always open to asking questions if we have something really interesting to share with. And of course, he is now local. He lives in West Seattle, right, Dr. Kennedy?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
we don't know for how long, right? Because
Yeah.
this job is pretty demanding, probably a lot of traveling and working on the field too. But by the time he's in our beautiful city, we can reach him, of course. Thank you, Dr. Kennedy, and I really appreciate your presence with us. I think if you could see the faces on our gallery, they are just not on the on the video right now, but I could see some smiles there. I don't know if you would like to give us last reflection to us.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate you having me, and I hope that not only did you learn a lot from this, but that you enjoyed it and found it interesting. And I just encourage you to look some more into biblical archaeology and history, because I think it really brings the Bible to life, and also just shows us that it's a historical document, not just a bunch of fairy tales. It's an important book, and there's evidence, there's scientific historical evidence that confirms it. And archaeology is something that really helps us to better understand those ancient times too.
Thank you, Dr. Kennedy. And of course, your knowledge you just shared with us reinforce our faith as a Christians, as an Adventist word, and we would like to extend, of course, a big thanks to you. Um, I think it is time to close our session and our lecture series, Spring Lecture Series 2021. It's been a good lecture series, I think. And of course, I would like to thank Gumi and Tad and all the tech all the tech team that make possible all those sessions, to the board for all the support, and of course to you, the membership of our church, because without you, this couldn't be possible. Since yesterday, we have a big attendance, and I really appreciate that your presence on this lecture series. Gumi, are we ready to close the session? Do you have something to say? No? Okay. I would like to close the session with a prayer. So I would like to invite you bow your heads. Our Heavenly Father, thank you, Lord, because you give us this beautiful opportunity over these 4 sessions to go through the history and the archaeology and reinforce our faith and the teachings we find on the Bible. Thank you, Lord, because you make us learn throughout the Bible what we need to learn. And of course, make us ability to go to the practice and tell others about this beautiful history that was brought for our benefits. Be with our community, be with our families, be with our Dr. Kennedy and his family. And please, after we close this session, stay with us in every moment, in every need we have. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next Sabbath. And happy